Welcome to our Natural Capital and Blue Economy panel. I'm Adonai Herrera Martinez, Director of Environmental Funds at the EBRD. The bank is excited to accelerate its natural capital and blue economy work with the help of the experts on today's panel. This topic is something very close to many of our hearts, including myself, growing up as the son of a biologist. As you might have seen through the annual meeting promotions, the RLC is the green and blue focus of this year's event. Lying on the border between Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, the RLC is one of the worst environmental disasters in human history. As part of our annual meeting, the EBRD will support a local NGO called CRAS, who engages with the community to help find innovative solutions around sustainable agriculture and resource efficiency. Now, I'd like to introduce our moderator for today's discussion, David Schuchman, science editor for the BBC News. From Antarctica to the Amazon, to the RLC, David reports on some of the biggest challenges of our time, including global warming, deforestation, and wildlife loss. Welcome, David, and thank you for being with us today for this exciting panel.
Adonai, thank you very much indeed. It is a great privilege to be moderator for this panel. The topic could not be more important and the time could not be more pivotal. We all know the bad news, don't we? The million species at risk of extinction, the destruction of the rainforest that seems to be accelerating, that I've seen for myself on repeated visits to the Amazon, the threats to the oceans. But we also now know, don't we, more and more about the value of these features of our planet, values not only in their own right, but values to us in the terms of the ecosystem services they provide. And I think we've got to pay tribute to the scientists who've done so much work to bring that to the fore and have raised awareness of this in a way that I think I've never seen before in nearly 20 years of reporting on these topics. The extraordinary extent to which governments are now talking about this. We had the G7 the other day, and the engagement, of course, of the corporate and, well, today the financial sector, which has, I think, just changed the way this whole debate has worked. So it's going to be great to be talking about this, and we've got a really star-studded panel. As we go through the debate this morning, I'm glad to say we've got an illustrator who's going to be depicting the course of events, Josh Knowles. At the moment, I guess you've got a blank sheet of paper there, but quite soon that'll be filled with your artwork, and we're going to keep tabs on you during the course of the hour. So good luck, and be keen to see what you come up with. So my first task as moderator is really a huge pleasure. It's to introduce someone who has literally transformed the way we humans see our role in the natural world. Jane Goodall is the renowned conservationist, famous around the world, who began her work in Tanzania studying chimpanzees in the wild. And if you haven't read it, this is essential reading. In the Shadow of Man, her first book, when we were investigating the terrible, cruel trade in baby chimpanzees a few years ago for BBC News, I kept this book by my side as a guide. So Jane did that landmark study in Tanzania and then went on to found the Jane Goodall Institute, which have pioneered so many innovative ways of thinking about conservation. And as if all of that wasn't enough, she's also founded Roots and Shoots, which is a grassroots organization, particularly engaging young people in some of the great issues of our time and coming up with innovative solutions to conservation. If you haven't watched Jane on social media engaging with brilliant, energetic young conservationists, that's a treat in store for you. So it's with great pleasure, Jane, that I say to you that the floor is yours. Over to you.
David, now I've got to live up to all that you've said, haven't I? Well, there's, we all know that the planet's in crisis, and a lot of societies in crisis too. And I think it's worth pointing out that the problems that we face, and you all know this, but they're created by us. And it's also worth emphasizing how all of this is interrelated. The pandemic, the climate change, and the loss of biodiversity. And it's our disrespect of animals and our disrespect of nature that has actually led to these crises. So we are destroying habitats, pushing animals into closer contact with people sometimes. We are hunting them, we're trafficking them, selling them in wildlife markets, crowding billions together in our intensive factory farms, people call them. And all of these situations create an environment where a bacteria such as COVID-19 can jump from an animal to a person. And when that happens, it may create a new disease, as was the case with this pandemic. And those studying these so-called zoonotic diseases, and by the way, 75% of all new human diseases are zoonotic in origin. And these scientists have been predicting a pandemic of this sort. And lo and behold, it's happening. So on the other hand, there has been this crazy idea, which some people are still clinging to. I'm not sure if they believe it or they don't want to believe it, but that you can have unlimited economic development on a planet with finite natural resources. And of course, that's not possible. Not if we carry on with business as usual, not if we don't find new ways of doing things. Because already in some cases, some places, the natural world is being used up faster than nature can replenish it. And at the same time, as we're just recklessly using up nature's resources, we're not facing up to the fact that our human population is still growing. Livestock numbers are shooting up as more people around the world eat more meat. There's over 7 billion of us on the planet now. There's predicted to be closer to 10 billion in 2050. So if we carry on with business as usual, doing things the way we are, then what's going to happen? I don't know. We must realize that we are part of and not separate from the natural world. Not only that, we depend on it. We depend on it for clean air and water and medicine, and well, we depend on it for everything. But what we depend on is healthy ecosystems. And I like to see an ecosystem, which is basically the biodiversity of an area, as like a beautiful tapestry of living things. And every time a species disappears, it's like pulling a thread from that tapestry. So if we pull enough threads, that tapestry will hang in tatters, and that will lead to ecosystem collapse. And as I said, we depend on healthy ecosystems. So again, we have to find new ways of doing things. And what must we do? We must alleviate poverty. Because if you're really poor, you're going to cut down the last trees to get land to try and grow food for your family. You're going to fish the last fish for the same reason. In an urban area, you're going to buy the cheapest food. You can't afford to ask, as the rest of us can, did it harm the environment? Was it cruel to animals? Is it cheap because of child slave labor or unequal wages? We must move towards renewable energy. And as you said, David, already, we must change our industrial farming method. And you mentioned this too. We must move back to small-scale family farms, to permaculture and regenerative agriculture. We have to ban factory farms. breeding places for disease. We have to ban wildlife markets for the same reason. We have to ban exotic pets. They carry their diseases with them. We've got to stop wasting. Our society is so horribly wasteful. And I don't know if you saw the other day the description of Amazon and its warehouses in the UK, and the huge amount, the tons and tons of brand new stuff, including 2,000 masks still in their original wrapper, into the dump. We've got to stop that. And the food waste. We waste all this food while other people are starving. And then we've got to restore and protect our forests. We've got to clean up the polluted ocean, these two great lungs of the world. And terribly important, education. Schools all need to have environmental education. And for the younger children particularly, it's so important, if possible, to have outdoor education. Because once the small children get to be out in nature, they love it. And when you love something, you want to protect it. So is there hope? Yes, there is. There's the young people, and I could talk for hours about it, but there isn't time. There's this brain, which is coming up with innovative technology and helping us as individuals to think about our own environmental footprint. And then there's the resilience of nature. Places we have totally destroyed can once again support life if we give it time and maybe some help. And there's so many examples around the world, including the rewilding, which is going on in Britain and right across Europe. So yes, there is hope, but I don't think the window of time to turn things around is that big, and it is still closing. We have to take action. And I just hope that all the statements made by governments and businesses around the world, I hope they really mean it, and I hope they will do what they say. Thank you.
Jane, thank you so much. And I think that image of pulling the thread on a living tapestry will stay with all of us for some time to come. And your words about the need for sincerity in the pledges for action. So thank you very much indeed, and we will see you again very shortly. It's now my pleasure to introduce the rest of our panel. Professor Sapata Dasgupta is at the University of Cambridge, researching the economics of welfare, development and the environment. He recently chaired the independent Dasgupta Review for the UK government, a landmark study of the economics of biodiversity. And I looked up a couple of quotes from him. He says that sustainable growth means rebalancing our relationship with nature. Nature is our home, he says, and good economics demand that we manage it better. So looking forward to hearing from you in just a moment. Next, we have Annabel Gonzalez, who has just been appointed, I think just last month, as Deputy Director General at the World Trade Organization. She's been a senior advisor for the Boston Consulting Group as part of a long and distinguished career in trade, investment, development. She was senior director of the Global Practice on Trade and Competitiveness at the World Bank, and was also Minister of Trade of Costa Rica. And last but not least, Pierre Rousseau, as senior strategic advisor for sustainable business at BNP Paribas. He develops collaborative relationships with the public sector and civil society, and he leads on innovative solutions to the financing of a sustainable transition. His interests include nature, biodiversity, carbon capture, and the blue economy. So it couldn't be more relevant, all of those things, to our discussion today. Now, just before we get into our debate, we want to include everybody in this session. So there are going to be a couple of questions on a poll for the audience, everyone in the audience to take part in. They'll be open for a couple of minutes from now. They should be on your screens, just 2 questions, multiple choice, take your pick, and we'll look at the results a little bit later during the course of this session and add that as fuel to our discussion. So take a look at those on your screen now, fill them in, and we'll get the results shortly. Let's move on to, if you like, our first sort of topic, really. And Partha, can I come to you? I mean, your work on the economics of biodiversity, just summarize for us, if you would, why you think it's just so fundamentally important that we do change the way that we value nature. And I think you're on mute.
Yes, sir.
There we go. Thank you.
Myself. Sorry about that. The reaction time is. The answer is pretty straightforward and stares at our face. Jane Goodall was pointing to ecosystems as being, in some deep sense, the unit of analysis. And that's certainly the unit of analysis in my review. These are assets. These are durable goods, self-regenerative, but they can be destroyed or degraded. And we're doing that. So just as we manage our other forms of assets, like produced capital, tables and chairs and machines and factories and so forth, and we manage our human capital, we get ourselves educated, and health provisions are available. We ought to be managing our natural capital. And I'm only concentrating at this point on the user value, that is to say, taking an anthropocentric viewpoint, because that's a minimal viewpoint, obviously, because nature has intrinsic value. Some aspects of nature have sacred value in every society. It's not just traditional societies. So, but stick to the user value, that is to say, the instrumental value of nature. They've been underpriced. In many cases, they're free. The high seas are free for transportation, for fishing, and increasingly, presumably, it's going to be mining. And the oceans are in dreadful state of affairs because we're putting pressure on it, because they're cheap, they're free. So technological progress also is directed towards undermining nature, because entrepreneurs want to economize on expensive factors of production, not cheap factors of production. So we shouldn't be surprised that on the whole, over the centuries, our technological innovations have been rapacious in the use of nature. So things are working against it. Finally, there are these distortions that are created in our daily lives by the fact that so much of nature is free, is exemplified by the fact that much of biodiversity, the diversity of life, and that's in some sense the characteristic of healthy ecosystems, lie in the tropics. And the tropics are also where the poorest people live on Earth. That happens. Now, undermining nature because it's underpriced in these poor countries means that when they export primary products to the West, let us say, just for the sake of argument, or richer countries, there is a transfer of wealth. And that is something that's not at all acknowledged. The fact that over the centuries, there's been a transfer of wealth from poor countries to the rich, with nobody, this is not a conspiratorial point. It's just happening because these are missing markets. A heck of a lot of missing markets. The poor are paying for that. So it's extremely important we put our house in order. Our lives depend on it. We are embedded in nature. Our economies are embedded in nature. But contemporary economics views nature as external to the human economy. And that's been a problem.
Arthur, thank you very much indeed. And Jane, hearing that and picking up on your talk just now, what do you think is missing to encourage businesses to account for their effect on nature? What's the bit that's missing in that, do you think?
I think the bit that's missing is that somehow there's been a disconnection between a clever brain and the human heart, where we poetically seek love and compassion. And businesses are making decisions with no thought for future generations. And that includes their own, because they're not stopping to think. And, you know, even now, as so many people are talking about setting new goals and standards as we emerge from the pandemic, there are political leaders and business leaders desperate to get back to business as usual. And so what's missing is wisdom. Cleverness, yes. Wisdom, we're losing it. And we need to start thinking more in the way that so many indigenous people thought, like what we do now, how will it affect the next generations? And we're actually busily still stealing the future of our children.
So a short-termism that has a terrible price, which leads me to Pierre. I mean, BNP Paribas is known for having thought about these issues for longer than most in the banking sector. What led the bank to think in this way, and what do you think it would take for others in your sector to engage in the same way along the lines that Jane is talking about?
Yeah, thank you, David. And I think after the inspiration of Dr. Jane Goodall and the clear explanation of Professor Dasgupta, the journey of the bank has been also to listen to those people. Just to remind that everything starts by the foundation that we have been financing through a foundation scientist people around climate change and biodiversity for the past 30 years. But what we forgot to do is to connect it to our business. So we were doing this as a philanthropy, but not really as part of the business. And I think thanks to our CEO and our management realized that we need to connect the dots between the two parts. The two parts who were separated. So we bring all this scientist vision and inspiration and knowledge and to put it in say, yeah, there is a disconnection with the business. So our management and senior management and CEO say that, how do we integrate in the business? And the first way to integrate in the business is to look at how the business is integrating nature into the model. And that's the first way we start to define the value. So if we want to answer that question, the company needs to create its own value creation. And so we create a value at the business level, at the company level. And then we realize if we want to implement, first of all, you need to create policies. So we start to define policies, what we do, what we don't do. Like, for instance, we decided to ban completely tobacco, or we decided not to do any business in the Arctic, etc., etc. And we have now 11 policies which are growing, and we are driving of business to decide based on our value what we don't do and what we do. And then we have to communicate that to our clients, because the bank is not deciding what to do. We have clients, investors and corporates, and then we need to align that with our clients. Then it means we have to create forum. You need to combine, and then this is why we decided to join Nature for Business, which was a kind of association in order to integrate with the rest of the world, because the complexity, it will be to connect the scientists, the business, the investors, and all the doers, the smallholders, the entire community that we need to connect. Then we decided in the business, what do we have? We have risk and we have opportunities. So we decided to look at the risk side. By destroying the nature, we define a certain number of risks that at the end financially will not be sustainable. So we have to start to make the link between the risk by destroying nature, by destroying water, by destroying that will at the end create a financial non-resilience, and then created problem even for the business and for the investor. Then we have also to look at the opportunities. So opportunities, what are the new change, the new model that we have? Dr. Jane Goodall mentioned that we need to change the way we do business. And the way we do business means that we have to create business and activities where not only we will integrate nature in the way we do business in order to avoid destruction or but we have to regenerate business. We have to recapture carbon. So we have to create what we call positiveness in the business. And we can only do that because of one thing, by giving a value to nature. And this is what has been explained previously by the Professor Dasgupta. And to do that, it's not happening in one day. So we need to create consortium. You need to create group of work. This is why we joined the TNFD, for instance, which is an equivalent to the TCFD in terms for defining for nature what will be the way that we can operate, the way we will do this transition. And last but not least, as we are in the existing world, we need to move to another world. So that means we will have to go to a transformation. People call it a transition, but I call it more a transformation, because I think we will go for disruption. We will go for circularity. which is not a linear world anymore. It's a disrupted world, or is a circular world, when we can value the waste, for instance, when we can take and not to put it in the dump like we used to do before. So valuation of new elements like carbon, like nature regeneration, and like the valuation of the whales will create new business model. And those new business model will have to have new way of financing. So we have to bring not only product in finance, but we need to bring solution. And solution is not done alone. It's not a bank alone who can do that. We need to create consortium working with science, working with regulators, with politicians, technology, and finally our clients, which are investors and corporates.
Yeah, thank you very much for spelling all that out. And let's move straight on to Annabelle. I mean, you're from a country that's famous for sort of getting it, as it were, joining those dots, making ecosystem protection a priority. What sort of lessons do you think can be learned for the rest of the world, in particular the regions that the EBRD operates in, from your experience in Costa Rica? And Annabelle, you're on mute. There we go. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, David. I probably have to start by saying that I think Costa Rica has made some interesting choices in crafting its development pathway. It ranks highly in sustainable well-being, or metrics like the Happy Planet Index that take into account the ecological footprint or the guardianship of land-based and marine ecosystems. And this is largely, I think, because Costa Rica recognizes the mutual supportiveness of nature, trade, and economic activity. And the pursuit of win-win options beneficial for environment and development has usually been the overreaching basis of many of its policies and practices. Now, some of the interesting things that Costa Rica has done to align its economic growth model with ambitious environmental objectives, and which may be of interest of the regions covered by EBRD, include raising resources domestically and seeking to incentivize climate and nature positive approaches through levies such as fuel tax, a car stamp duty, energy fees to promote renewables and protect biodiversity. It has also received grants and debt relief to expand forest and marine conservation programs. And this in turn has allowed the country to leverage its biological diversity, for example, by regulating bioprospecting and bringing traditional medicine to new markets, as well as by promoting ecotourism, the most important category of trading services before the pandemic. So let me just say a word on this to try to make it practical. So sustainability is the core principle of development of tourism in the country. And one important tool to help ensure this is the Certificate for Tourism Sustainability. So this is a program designed to classify and to differentiate tourism companies according to the degree of sustainability in their management and operations, while considering natural, cultural, and social issues. So the core objective is basically to translate the concept of sustainability into something that is real and practical, while at the same time ensuring that businesses can boost their own productivity and help the country's competitiveness overall. So the program requires businesses to improve their use of natural and social resources, promotes active participation of local communities, and offers businesses support to achieve the necessary improvements. So it basically aims at avoiding growth that is not aligned with these objectives. So the certificate establishes a scale from 1 to 5, where each number indicates the relative position of the company in terms of sustainability. This in turn allows the company to access resources, and very importantly, it also serves as a branding tool in a competitive tourism market. So I think these are some interesting ideas of the kind of policies and programs that can be put in place, again, to align environmental sustainability with economic development goals.
That's really interesting that you developed that metric for sustainability, and perhaps we'll hear more about that later. So thank you so much for that. Let's just see how Josh Knowles, our illustrator, is getting on. I don't know whether we can get a shot of his work so far, just after this, as we're halfway through. There he is. He's done a lot of work. He's been busy while we've been talking. Well done. We'll discuss that later, but there's clearly a lot of insights are displayed in that one image. Thank you, Josh, and we'll come back to you shortly. Jen, let me pick up with something that really stuck in my mind in your first book, In the Shadow of Man. You're in a plane, you're flying over the Gombe Reserve where you're studying, working with the chimpanzees, and you see not only how small the reserve is, but how there's human habitation all around it. And the thought that strikes you is that no conservation effort will ever work without engagement of local communities. I'm just wondering how you've sort of developed that idea as you've progressed in your work in this area. Oh, Jane, you're on mute. If you wouldn't mind just hitting the, there we go. Thank you. We just missed the first few words.
So it was very memorable, that flight over Gombe. I'd been in Africa trying to learn more about the problems facing the chimpanzees with their numbers dropping, forests disappearing. And then it all came to a head when I flew over Gombe. What I'd been witnessing was the crippling poverty and lack of health and education facilities and degradation of the land around chimpanzee habitats. So I was learning about people as well as chimps. And then Gombe, when I began in 1960, was part of the great equatorial forest belt that stretched right over to the west coast. And as you describe, I look down now in the late 1980s at this small patch of forest, all that was left, bare hills all around. And if we can't help these people, it hit me, to find ways of living without destroying the environment, we can't save chimps, forests, or anything else. And so we began a program, Take Care or Takari. There's no time to describe it, but it's very holistic. And it includes not only restoring fertility to the land, but scholarships to keep girls in school, because it's shown all around the world as women's education rises, then family size tends to drop, and family size in Africa is a huge growing problem. And also microcredit opportunities for particularly women based on Mohammed Yunus's Grameen Bank, and many other things as well. And gradually the people in the 12 villages around Gombe came to trust us. And we introduced cutting edge technology so that they could plan out their land use, satellite imagery, and our Roots and Shoots program for young people in all the schools, so that they were learning from the beginning the importance of nature. And that program has been so successful. It's now throughout chimp range in Tanzania. It's in around chimp habitat in 6 other countries in Africa where JGI is working. And the people have become our partners in conservation because now they understand and can see that protecting the environment isn't just for wildlife, as they had been led to believe by other NGOs, but for their own sustainable future.
That's such a powerful point, Jane. Thank you. And Pierre, I mean, how does that thinking apply to the business world? I mean, how can one join those dots from the scenario Jane's describing?
But I will immediately give example of project that we're working on. So at least it will give a practical view of what can be done. First of all, I can give an example of, and all in this example is about integrating the externalities into the project. And there is one thing that has been said during this conversation here is the integration between climate change, biodiversity or nature and people. We cannot exclude one of them. They have to be all together, especially the people, because as mentioned before by Professor Dasgupta, sometimes by solving the poverty of the people, we can just solve the problem of biodiversity and the problem of climate change. And so we work on several projects. I will give you projects which are, the way we see it is two ways. First, we have projects which are related to agriculture and biodiversity, because there is a link of activities there, which is quite obvious. And after, we have projects which are starting from conservation of biodiversity, who are generating new activities. In the first example, we have, for instance, the Subnational Climate Fund, which has been created recently. We are about to launch it. And this is a fund to finance renewable energy for 5 to 50 million. So that means all the projects that too small for a bank and too big for a philanthropy. This represents 70% of the need of renewable energy in emerging market. And majority of those projects are nature-based solutions, because we need to create energy from stability. So the sources will be the biodiversity, will be the biomass. And so we have biomass projects, which are nature-based solutions. Then we create a consortium of, you can see it's complex. It's not just finance who can solve that. So we create a consortium where you have a technical assistance and you have a facility for funding, commercial. It has to be commercial. And then we have IUCN, which is providing the verification that we have all nature-based solution. We have Gold Standard, which is providing the review of the impact. And we have R20, which is NGOs specialized to set up project and due diligence in emerging market. And then we have on the other side an asset manager, which is Pegasus, and we have a bank like us, which is providing all the administrative and support assistance and the complementarity in financing. So by putting those people together, we managed to create and to fund those projects by taking all the different expertise that we do need. And the fund itself is created by blended finance. So we have to mix finance in order to do that. So the Green Climate Fund is providing what we call a junior investor. And so we can attract senior investor to come into the game. We have done this. This is an example of where we are integrating nature into business. We have other example in the north of France when we are doing a healthy soil, when we are doing regenerating farming, and we are putting in place a scheme for regenerating farming for farmers to move from traditional industrial farming to regenerating farming. And here again, the biodiversity recovery, as well the carbon capture, is taking into account in the scheme. But one scheme, one example I want to show as really proving that what has been said previously by Dr. Jane Goodall, it's happening at a large scale. We just create the Global Coral Reef Fund. The coral reef, it's definitely not something generating activities straight away, but it's something which is important for the life of billions of people, because this is the basic nature and basic food they can get from the sea. So what we do, the idea came from foundation. So Monaco Albert Sumo Foundation, Paul Allen Foundation. Then we had the UNDP, and we create again a grant facility, which is identifying all projects in the 26 countries where the coral is the most resilient in emerging market. And then we are setting up projects which at the beginning are not profitable, and we make them investable. And then we create around the marine protected area that we have, we are creating additional business like we have been explained before: ecotourism, sustainable fishing, permaculture. We make sure that the infrastructure around has been cleaned up, like a decarbonization, making sure that agriculture is not polluting anymore with the fertilizer, etc. So we create an ecosystem and we finance the ecosystem. And then when we do that, we manage to do three things. We manage to make the funding of the marine protected area resilient. We give job to local people. We can remunerate investor for that. And at the end, by doing all these small projects into a global fund, we can replicate models and standards, and we can extend it to different countries. So
yeah,
from
thank
conservation,
you for that. It's
from
great to hear
conservation,
those examples.
For conservation, we are creating new business. And this is demonstrate that nature, if it's well maintained, can develop activities which are resilient, economically speaking and financially speaking.
Really interesting to hear those specific examples. Thank you, Pierre. And let's take it to a different angle, if you like, with Annabelle in terms of trade. I mean, trade is controversial in this context, isn't it? Because it can cut both ways. I mean, you can see the impact of soya trade on Amazon deforestation, for example. But in what ways do you think trade can serve as a positive force?
Thank you, David. Let me start by saying that trade can support a more sustainable world. Proactive and forward-looking trade approaches can be part of a coordinated and effective solution in tackling mounting environmental challenges while fostering economic and social development. International trade is unique in that it promotes specialization, competition, and innovation globally. And these powerful forces, if properly harnessed, can help make the world economy more sustainable and resilient to environmental risks, while having positive effects on incomes, on jobs, and on equality. And let me share with you a great example of how global cooperation in the World Trade Organization, in the WTO, can support very important objectives. The sustainability of our oceans, delivering on the Sustainable Development Goal number 14.6, and the livelihoods of fisherwomen and men across the world, in particular those in artisanal fishing. So we know that fish stocks are at risk of collapsing in many parts of the world due to overexploitation. It is estimated that over a third of global stocks are overfished today, compared to about 10% in the 1970s, meaning that they are being exploited at a pace where the fish population cannot replenish itself. Declining fish stocks threaten to worsen poverty and endanger coastal communities that rely on fishing, affecting directly some 39 million people around the world. And we know that healthy seas are also important for food security, with fish providing some 20% of animal protein needs for about some 3.3 billion people. Now, in theory, fishing should be held in check by its very environment. Low fish stocks should mean fishing takes more time and it costs more money. The problem, however, is that often state funding keeps unprofitable fishing fleets at sea. It is estimated that global fisheries subsidies range from $14 billion to $54 billion. So the WTO negotiations on fisheries subsidies seek to curtail harmful subsidies that are applied and that cause damage to global fish stocks and their underlying ecosystems. The focus is on securing agreement on disciplines to eliminate subsidies for illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing, and to prohibit certain forms of fishery subsidies that contribute to overcapacity and overfishing, with special and differential treatment being an integral part of the discussions. Now, this is a priority for our new Director General, Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, who has convened a ministerial level meeting in 2 weeks from now, exactly July 15, here in Geneva, to receive guidance from trade and fisheries ministers on potential landing zones in these negotiations that would allow us to restrain the harmful subsidies and at the same time preserve and sustain access to fisheries resources. So again, I think this is an excellent example of how trade rules and trade disciplines can be brought together to support broader environmental objectives.
Thank you, Annabelle. And I'm enjoying hearing these very specific examples. I think it conveys the points so effectively. Partha, I wonder whether I could turn to you. We've talked about the demand side, the need for increased investment in nature-based solutions, but what about incentivizing the supply side of nature?
Thank you very much. I was rather inspired by Pierre's description of what his group are doing, and the question arises as to how to universalize that to throughout the private sector, never mind governments for them. And one of the things that I've explored in the review is that, I mean, it's a conclusion actually, rather than a hypothesis. It's that eventually it will have to be citizen-driven movement that makes us bear account of what we're doing to nature. In other words, regarding it as a capital asset and then paying for it, so to speak. And one way it can do it, and it's happening in many other spheres with regard to our health, for example, we demand that companies that are selling us food disclose the contents of the food that we buy because we care about our health. Likewise, we could insist, if we wish to, as citizens, I mean, that firms disclose their entire supply chain. Now think of, again, I want to go back to the idea that so much of the primary products are in the tropics. And it's there, the primary products are then converted eventually into final products, let us say, in the West or wherever the product goes to. And disclosure is a substitute, would be a substitute for the fact that there is serious moral hazard here. We don't know what firms do. It's how do we provide the incentive towards firms to take nature into account and pay for it in inverted commas, even if there are no markets. Take the scarcity value of nature seriously. They would if they had to account for it to the consumer. What are you doing to the rainforest from which you're plucking objects and then transforming? What are you in terms of converting into, let us say, cocoa farms? Okay, final product is here, but we don't really know the description of what is happening. An incentive, if consumers demand that that happens, then firms will be obliged to do that. And in doing so, they will actually increase their profitability, long-term profitability, because they're actually paying for the stuff that they're using as opposed to running it down over time. Okay, and you can't do that through the price system. I think it's wrong to think that prices will always be usable in some sense as a structure of incentives. Because for a variety of technical reasons, this is not the place to go into, but my review makes clear there is a lot of technical reasons as to why prices won't do and why people like Jane and Pierre move towards quantities restrictions. There's a good deal of economic logic behind it. It has to do with the fact that much of nature is in fact silent and she's invisible. The processes are invisible. And so that makes markets not very handy. And of course, nature is on the move all the time. Okay, so these are reasons as to why the intuitive sense of using quantity restrictions, protected zones, and so forth, and disclosure of the character of trade that a firm is engaged in when it moves primary products and processes them into final products is necessary. Remember, the disclosure is like quantity constraints because you're characterizing what you're actually doing to the stuff up there, not through prices. So yes, I think that's one way I would think of looking at the supply side, which is what your question was. In other words, protecting nature, waiting to allow nature to rebuild herself is an investment. And don't forget it, its investment doesn't mean breaking down, mining stuff. That's not what it is. Investment also can mean just simply waiting, planting a seed, waiting it to grow. That's investment because you're not harvesting the product until later. So yes, these are many, I mean, I won't go into anything further, but citizen is absolutely essential. And that is why I applaud the idea that we ought to have our educational systems reformed.
So that's the citizen armed with the tools of transparency to expose the whole process. Right. That's so fascinating. Now look, we've got the results in from the poll questions. The first question was, what's the most crucial thing that needs to be done to deliver a nature positive future? 50% said it's accounting for nature and putting a value on natural capital. And the second question was, would putting a value on natural capital prove sufficient to protect natural habitats? And actually 80% of you said, no, this is just one part of a complex puzzle to protect our land and our oceans. So an interesting pair of results there. And we'll just come on to those to discuss them in just a second, but let's check in with Josh. Let's see what the artist is making of the discussion so far, if we can bring up a shot of Josh there. Interesting how the words, well, value and nature stand out for me. A little leaf just popped up there in the bottom right of the picture. 7 billion people is prominent up in the top left. And the phrase natural assets are not free over in the top right. So there's an interesting collection of thoughts there. Sorry, let me just switch that. I get a nuisance caller who rings on that number. I should have disconnected. Thank you so much, Josh. And we'll take one more look at you just before we wrap up. So, I mean, taking stock of that, Jane, clearly the feeling in the audience is that it's essential to value natural capital, but it's that on its own won't be enough. What do you make of that?
Well, I think it's right, because it requires more than that, I think. And, you know, this is why, in a way, I've spent so much time for the last 30 years developing our program for young people, because if they grow up understanding the financial aspect of what we're doing, understand the harm to nature of what we're doing, learn to respect animals and people and different cultures and different nationalities and religions, then I think they will automatically, because they're all different, move out into these other areas that people feel, you know, just putting a value on nature isn't enough.
Because sorry.
No, go on.
I was just going to say that within the environmental movement, there are those who say we shouldn't put a dollar sign on a mangrove swamp or a rainforest, but others who say that without doing that, you're never going to engage people or businesses.
Yeah, well, I completely agree that we do need to put a value on it, because the people who say we shouldn't probably haven't had much experience with the extreme poverty of people living there and the difference that it makes if you put a value on nature. And although I don't like the thought of putting a value on nature, I respect nature for itself. Nevertheless, for the people living there, I think it's very important. That's why ecotourism is so important. It brings foreign exchange into the government, so they're happy. And it brings businesses working in safari camps, for example, being guides. It brings business to the local people if it's properly controlled and not just run out of all, you know, some of it is terrible. I mean, I talked to somebody the other day and he was on the Serengeti and his driver said, oh, I've heard on my, you know, cell phone that there's a lion kill over there. They get there and there are 32 minibuses because all the drivers are being called to this one place. That is destroying what you've gone to see. So yes, put a value on it. It's really important.
That's so interesting. And I should say that to everyone watching that our Q&A is open. So do send in your questions and I'll put them to the panel. I mean, in the context of valuing natural capital, Partha, I wonder if I could come to you with a question about your sense and picking up from what Annabelle was saying about trade. I mean, how does one go forward in the most positive way in the context of your work for the Dasgupta Review?
Well, in terms of trade, the intellectual basis for free trade was a hypothesis that every commodity has a competitive price attached to it. We forget that. The gains from trade are based on that fundamental hypothesis. And of course, our entire discussion this morning is over goods and services for which there are no prices because the market has failed, that there aren't institutions. So the idea of free trade being the engine of human well-being, it's just, frankly speaking, it's rubbish because it doesn't have a theoretical foundation. So we really have to find ways by which to tame trade so that it doesn't, the expansion isn't accompanied by further destruction of the natural world, which is the one which is mainly free. So yes, we need to remove subsidies, that's for sure. And a few billion was a real underestimate because it was targeted only on fisheries. If you, the OECD estimates of the global subsidies on energy and water and so forth, if you include that, we are looking at about $5 to $6 trillion a year, which is unbelievably high. So it's not only that nature is free, it has a negative price because of these. So we're paying ourselves in order to break it down, to destroy nature. So that's extremely important in the sense that it's not an anti-trade argument I was giving. It's trade without getting the prices approximately right is wrong. Finally, one further point in response to the questions that are coming up. The idea is that, of course, valuing nature, I'm not sure even what that means. We are looking at ecosystems and we are asking what is the cost, social cost, loss in well-being in the ecosystem in question, being tarnished, its health deteriorating, say because of biodiversity loss or whatever. Now you want to measure that, and that's what Jane was exactly right. Everybody who is an asset holder, and that means everybody on Earth is an asset manager, has to look and see what the benefits of holding these assets are, what portfolio to hold. It's not just it could be a farmer, it could be a fisherman, it could be you name it. Okay, so the valuation exercise is just a start, and it doesn't mean that you have institutions that will respect those values. In other words, you move away from the idea that you can establish markets for everything. So we're moving away from that. The valuation is a start. You now look for institutions, design institutions, which will be able to incorporate the worth of natural capital when decision makers choose one way or the other. That's the idea. The idea is to organize, create institutions such that the incentives people have to do one thing rather than another are aligned to the pursuit of the common good. That should be the hallmark. That is the hallmark of economics, as I understand it. And whether it comes through markets in part, whether it comes through quantity controls from another, or whether it, in this case, which I've been advocating for quite some time now since the review was published, is creation of an international institution, organization, akin to the World Bank, IMF, that will manage the global commons, like the high seas, the atmosphere, and also pay for the protection of the rainforests, which are global commons, but within national jurisdiction. So they're not open access, but you need to subsidize them, like the Costa Rican institution of payment for ecosystem services. We could do that on a grand scale, and we need to do that, otherwise the oceans are dead.
That's so well put. Thank you so much. And let's just take a question from the audience, which actually picks up on that point. And let me put it to Annabelle. What are the biggest issues to achieving transparency in the supply chain? I mean, that seems to be such a key element in all of this. And you're on mute, Annabelle. There we go. Thank you.
Thank you. So transparency in supply chains is something that is increasingly relevant in the trade world for many reasons. We've been talking from the environmental perspective, but for instance, right now in the context of the pandemic, transparency of supply chains is also very important in terms of mitigating risks in the health front. So this is something that we at the WTO have been looking at. There are important systems in place, for instance, for transparency in the area of agriculture. And there is, increasingly, I think, greater interest on the parts of governments, but also on the parts of businesses. And a number of countries and regions have put in place in recent regulation for bringing greater transparency in the supply chain, not only with, say, tier 1 suppliers, but also tier 2, tier 3 suppliers, looking at environmental sustainability and governance issues in the context of the supply chain. So I would have to agree that this is something that is quite relevant in going forward.
Okay, thank you very much for that. And one for you, Pierre, again from the audience, and it builds on topics that we've we've explored in this session. But I mean, what do you see as the main barriers for large organizations, I guess like yours, but you've pushed through this already, to move from a single focus on financial performance to something that's more holistic, more sustainable? I mean, you've touched on this before, but what are the breakthrough moments, if you like, to persuade the board of a large company to go down this road? Pierre, you're on mute. Still there, I'm afraid. Yeah, we're still, I'm afraid, not hearing you. I don't know if it's a problem at this end or at yours.
Do you hear me?
There we go. You're back. Great to have you back with us. Yeah.
Sorry about that.
I don't know if you heard the question. It's really just about.
Yes, I did. I did.
Okay.
The first barriers, I would say, has been already expressed, is the short-termist and the long-termist. Especially in finance, everything has been done to think about a short stability, and regulators and everybody work on the shorts. So now it's time to also complete it by having a long-term view. After the other big barriers is the transformation. I would like to come to the supply chain, and the way that the supply chain as it exists today will change. And I think the commodities which are extractive commodities, which is just to go and pick up a commodities versus a price, I think it will disappear slowly. And we will come more and more to the ecosystem or the landscape. Because if we want to monetize everything into, and I will take again the example, when a farmer is producing goods, but he got also biomass that he can be used for making electricity, for instance. So when a company will look at working with a corporate who is extracting resources from somewhere, they will also look at the security of the resources to make sure on the long term. So there will be, as Professor Dasgupta mentioned, there is other parameter than price that will take into account more and more, and we will have to integrate that. And so it means that today with the scope 3, which is obliging, and the people who have made this commitment of net zero in 2050, they will have to look at the supply chain, and they will have to change the supply chain, and making sure that the supply chain is not creating any problem in terms of climate change, so completely decarbonized, but also is completely free of deforestation, and also is making sure that you create resilience by making sure that the people on the ground will have the right level of living in order to continue to produce what they have to produce. So it means that then we will start to think more like an ecosystem or like a landscape. And this is good in finance. Why? Because it will generate several sources of cash flow instead to have only one source of cash flow. And this will allow at the same time to take into account other elements than the pure elements of the finance. And there is another point that we need to link now today of what we do is resilience. We need to create an ecological resilience. We need to create a social resilience. We need also to have an economical and financial resilience to make sure that we can continue to maintain the environmental and social resilience.
Okay, thank you. Look, we are running out of time. As ever with these things, there's so much fascinating stuff to discuss. A great question has come in, and it picks up on something that I think Jane raised earlier. We're obviously heading for a massively larger global population. That has an impact on nature. How should we think about this? Partha, should I just lob that one to you, and only for a brief answer, if you may?
Well, as a kickstart, the observation that population matters is extremely important because it's one of the factors that influence our global demand on the biosphere, okay? It's other factors too, but this is one important one because total demand depends on the average demand multiplied by the total number, okay? So the numbers do matter. So that's the first point. The second is that we tend to avoid discussing population for reasons I do not quite understand, but it may have to do with the fact that it has had a checkered career in some countries where there were draconian measures introduced, and but that's not an argument for people who think about these matters to pretend that we shouldn't think about them at all. And I think the first thing to do is to start with women's rights and women's empowerment. Now, at the moment, more than 200 million women in their reproductive ages in the poorest parts of the world are lacking in family planning facilities. There's an unmet need. In other words, they would like to have it, but they don't have it. And so the first thing I think we should do is to urge our governments, those who give aid, to take family planning very seriously in their aid budget, because it's not good enough to say, this is one of those things where you have a win-win situation. You care about women's empowerment, and you care about their ability to choose. We think that investment in education is the one route. On the other hand, the success rate is rather low in education. By the World Bank's estimate, 30% of women in the age group 15 to 24 are continue to be illiterate. So family planning is a sort of a low-hanging fruit, as my American colleagues say, for attaining, enabling countries, the poorest countries, to attain fertility.
Partha, thank you for that. I'm going to stop you there. And I've seen Jane nodding in agreement at a couple of those points, particularly about education for women. Look, we're really running out of time. Jane, I'd just like to put a great question to you just to help us wrap up. And I know what the answer is going to be. Do you have hope that we as humans will figure it out before it's too late? I know that you, in your opening remarks, you referred to hope, and I know you're optimistic by nature as a soul. Help us just with that. Do you think we will crack this before time runs out? Jane, you're on mute.
Always on mute.
And we don't want to miss this. This will be a gem.
I was simply going to say the answer to that is we simply must work out a better future. I mean, I have grandchildren. It's my responsibility to crack this nut for their future. Lots of people should think that way. That's why our Roots and Shoots program is now in over 60 countries, and they're learning respect for each other, respect for different ways of thinking, respect for animals, respect for the environment. And education, and yes, family planning is terribly important, and the women want it, as we heard. So we can crack it because of especially the young people who are responding to the challenges, who are rolling up their sleeves, who are getting out there and taking action. They're changing the world even as we sit here talking. Around the world, there's young people out there planting trees and clearing up trash and going into schools and starting clubs and talking and sharing their experiences. And, you know, and the last thing I must say, because I'm who I am, when I say respect, I mean respect for animals, and the chimpanzees help people understand that there isn't a gap between us and the other animals, that they are sentient beings. And I'm sure many of you watched My Octopus Teacher, The Intelligence of the Octopus. So it all ties together, because out there in this environment that we've been talking about, its services, it's the home for sentient beings who can feel fear and pain. And it's up to us to help them, to help those living in poverty, to dispel ignorance, which leads to so many problems. And finally, the young people. There was a question about how do we change the CEOs of a big company? It's happening with the kids. I've met CEOs who've said, well, I had to move in that direction because my kids insist.
That's a very stirring and hopeful way to wrap things up. As I thought a gem from Jane Goodall at the end there to bring our discussion to a close. I had a little speech prepared, but Jane, you've done it. I mean, I think the only point to make is that in the 20-odd years I've been reporting on this, nature, conservation, biodiversity have suddenly shifted from being a nice to have optional extra that some government or company might boast about, to being a really central part of a really vital discussion about how we go forward. So thank you all very much indeed. Let's take a final look at Josh's artistic summary of our discussion. And let's see if we can bring that up for a final look at how he's summed things up. And I think, well, yes, look, trade rules has appeared there at the top. Value and nature still, I think, the most prominent features of this drawing. And a terrible price bottom right, short-termism. Thank you very much indeed. So to Josh, to Jane, Partha, Annabelle, and Pierre, and the organizers of this session, it's been really fascinating. Thank you all very much indeed.
And thank you, David, very much indeed.
It's been a great pleasure.
Moving us through.
Thank you all and good luck.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you very much for